Okay, good evening, everybody. Hopefully, everyone could hear me. We're going to get started. First of all, tonight's learning is in the merit of the Jewish people in the land of Israel, those who are on the front lines, those who are being held hostage, those that need safety and security wherever they may be. As usual, classes are open for sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor a class, please contact us and we can make it happen. All right, let's get going. So, in last week's Torah portion, before the Exodus, one of the things that God told the Jewish people to do was, besides having the Passover Seder and putting the blood on their doorposts, after all that, God tells Jewish people, okay, go to the Egyptians and ask them for gold and silver. We'll read inside Exodus chapter 11, verse 2. Daber no baznei speak to the people. Vishalu ish meiseriu v'isha meiserusa. Every man requests and every woman requests from her friend klechasu chayzahav, gold and silver vessels. So Rashi comments that this was in the part of the promise of Abraham. That Abraham was promised that after the Jewish people will leave with great wealth. So in order to fulfill this, the Jewish people had to get paid for their slavery. Essentially, they were working for free for 210 years. They were in Egypt, and about 100 of them, let's just give or take a little more, 110, they were slaves. So because of that, the Jewish people asked for payment, and they got it. As it says in Exodus 12, 35, 36, Jews did as Moses said. They requested from the Egyptians silver and gold articles and clothing. God made the Egyptians respect the people, and they granted their request. Thus, the Jewish people drained Egypt of its wealth. As it says in the Medrash, this was like they had cleaned it out like a net with no fish. Okay, the Jewish people the Egyptians had no more wealth, it seemed. Okay. So what happens after this week's Torah portion? We have the splitting of the sea. The Jewish people leave Egypt. They're being chased by the Egyptians. They get to the Red Sea and it splits. The Jewish people walk through, and it comes crashing down on the Egyptians. The Egyptians are washed up on the shore to prove to the Jewish people that God had saved them. Right, because otherwise they could say, "Well, we came out this side, maybe the Egyptians came out another side." So God made the Egyptians a miracle. I'm not an expert in tides, but apparently, naturally, the Egyptians should not have washed up to shore at the same shore the Jewish people came out of. But for whatever reason, God made this miracle to show the Jewish people against nature, as if nature had anything to do with the splitting of the sea. But even that was again a miracle to show the Jewish people that the Egyptians had perished. Now, it says after this whole ordeal of the splitting of the sea, it says Vayasa Moshe, and Moses led the Israelites. Now, the word Vayisa, or Vayasa, and he led them. Rashi says, why he led them? Why not the Jewish people traveled, or the Jewish people were led? What does it mean, and Moses led them? So Rashi comments, why and he led them? Against their will. For the Egyptians had adorned their horses with gold and silver and precious stones, and the Jews found it all over. It found it all in the sea. The spoils of the sea were more significant than the spoils they attained in Egypt. Moses, therefore, had to lead them against their will. So that the fact that he actually, Rashi says this was against the Jewish people's will, because they didn't want to leave. There was all this gold and silver sitting on the shore. So Moses had to force them and said, okay, enough, let's go. God told us to continue traveling. Now, just to understand how much they had collected already before they had left Egypt, it says in the Talmud, Tractate Brachos, page 5, folio B. there was not one member of the Jewish people that did not have 90 some sort of white donkeys laden with silver and gold with Egypt. So that was considered like that was minimum 90 donkeys filled with silver and gold. So that's pretty wealthy. That's a tremendous amount of wealth that Jewish people had accumulated. So that is what happens. That is the story. So now we're going to talk about what is the significance of this idea. So just to give a little bit of a background, the Jewish people, it says that Jewish people experience a revelation of God so amazing, so special at the splitting of the sea. It says that they were able to point, that little children were able to point and say, Zekeli, this is my God. Like they saw godliness itself. There was no, it was not clothed in some sort of parable. They saw God Himself. So, in fact, it says that they saw more than the prophet Ezekiel saw. Now, if you look at the prophet Ezekiel describes the Kisei HaKavod, the throne of God, so to speak, and he describes it with tremendous adjectives. And they actually saw more at the Red Sea than Ezekiel had seen in his vision. So obviously there was a tremendous thing. So it doesn't really make sense that the Jewish people coming from such a spiritual high, literally 5 seconds before, 5 minutes before, and then they're busy collecting gold and silver. So there's a little bit more going on here. What is really going on is in Jewish mysticism, it talks about the idea of Shviras HaKelim, of the breaking of the vessels. Now, just to give a background to this very intricate concept, is that when God created the world, He used different attributes, right? Kindness, severity, beauty, all these different attributes that God has, and He used it to create the world. So in order to, He has to first allow these attributes to be defined, and by defining these attributes, then He's able to use them to create the world. Because using like the idea of a spigot of water, if you have a spigot of water, you can open the spigot, water comes out, and you're able to collect it in a cup. Now, however, if you were to put the same cup under Niagara Falls, it wouldn't work. What would happen? The cup would just smash into smithereens. It would fall away. There's too much. So it has to be more defined. So that is the process of creation. That God first defines the specific attributes. Okay, this is going to go here, and this is going to go there, and that way the world is able to actually be a world, a physical, limited, non-spiritual material world. So when in the first stage of creation, it was called Tohu. It says in Bereshis, in the second verse of the Torah, V'haaretz ha'isasayu v'avayu, the world was chaos. So what does it mean the world was chaos? The world was chaos. It means that the world, that even though God had defined the specific characteristics of the world, He had defined the godliness that would give life to the world, He hadn't defined it in the way that we know today. In other words, He had defined it that even though they were defined, they still had no way of being compatible with any other characteristic. So in other words, God created kindness, but kindness was so in itself, so focused on itself, that it just, imagine you have somebody yelling down the street, kindness, 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 and running and pushing his message. You can't listen to somebody else. So when someone else comes and tries to say, well, listen, there's a time for kindness, but there's a time for, again, I'm using this as a parable, but there's a time for, being strict, being powerful, being strong, for the opposite of kindness. But he can't hear him. He's so into himself. He doesn't hear anything. So he runs it right over. So that's kind of what happened in this first world. It's called the world of chaos. And every single type of godly characteristic that God used to create the world was so just totally into itself. And there was no way they could communicate with each other. They couldn't get into each other. And what ends up happening is it ends up exploding. I'll use that word for lack of a better one, as it says in Kabbalah, in the holy books, a great amount of light and few receptacles. Again, using that, just there wasn't enough way to capture what was there. So it ends up breaking. Then we have God recreates the world in the way of tikkun, which means to correct this mistake, and this becomes the purpose of the world, is correcting this mistake of, use that word mistake, can't really say mistake about God, this was the plan, but correct the previous world. So what is it? What now? So we discussed the world of chaos. We discussed the world of tikkun, the world of correction that we exist in, but we didn't discuss what happened to the world of chaos. What happened to all these extreme spirituality that couldn't coexist with each other? So what ends up happening is that it falls, and it falls really, really hard. And it falls. These, so to speak, broken vessels fall, and they exist as godly sparks trapped in the lowest of the low things. And therefore, it becomes the purpose of the world that when we use physical items, there's always some sort of godly spark in that physical thing. And by using it for the correct purpose for which it was created, we could elevate these sparks. Okay, that's in a nutshell what it is. Now, when it comes to these godly sparks, the Torah tells us, that the Jewish mysticism tells us, that there are 288 sparks total in the world. But because when something falls, it falls to the lowest place possible. The most of the sparks fell into Egypt, which was considered the lowest place of the world of that time. So when the Jewish people left, it says, "Vagam erev rav Allah itam." They also came up with the mixed multitude. Now the word erev means mixed, and rav means multitude. Could also be, rav is 202. So out of the 288 sparks, 202 came with the Jewish people. So from Egypt. So in other words, they had totally elevated every single spark in Egypt. They took them with them, and therefore, in fact, the Torah gives a prohibition, and it's based in Lurianic Kabbalah, discusses this idea that there's a prohibition of going back to Egypt. The Torah tells us, you shall not go back to Egypt. And the question is, why can't you go back? So in Jewish mysticism, it explains, in the Lurianic Kabbalah, it explains this is the reason, because we did our job there. We took out all the sparks that had landed in this land. There's no reason to go back there. Okay, so now hopefully I gave a decent explanation of this general idea. So now, going back to what was happening in the Jewish people, they weren't just going to collect gold and silver, but they were doing this. First of all, God had told them to take all the gold and silver from Egypt on a very basic level, right? This was a commandment of God, but also they understood that this was the whole purpose of their coming down to Egypt, was to find these sparks and to take them with them. So when they see all this gold and silver laying there, after the Egyptians wash up on the shore, they said, wait, we didn't finish our job. Let's go grab them. We got to do our job. So this wasn't like some, they had just seen godliness and now they were like distracted by gold and silver. They had seen godliness, and they said, we got to finish the job that God had given us. They were inspired by the godliness to finish the job and to take it. However, Moses explained to them that the job had already been finished, and therefore they were to continue and follow the commandment of God to continue on their journey towards Mount Sinai and the giving of the Torah. Now that we just explained what the Jewish people were doing, we have to turn to what was Moses doing at the same time the Jewish people were collecting gold and silver in Egypt. What was Moses doing? So it says in Exodus chapter 13, verse 19, "Vayikach Moshe es atzmos Yosef imo," that Moses took the remains of Joseph with him, because Joseph had promised the Jewish people that there would be a redemption, and then when there is a redemption from Egypt, you shall take my bones out of Egypt, and take them. So we see that while God had commanded the Jewish people and gave them this very spiritual commandment to collect all the wealth of Egypt and take it with them, Moses was not doing that. Moses was busy with Joseph. So, in fact, in the Mechilta of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, it explains this idea as follows. He says, see how precious the mitzvahs were to Moses. While all the Jewish people were occupied with the spoils of Egypt, Moses was busy fulfilling a commandment. In this regard, the verse says, the wise-hearted choose mitzvahs. Okay, so it goes through, how did Moses know? Maybe we just go through it quickly. How did Moses know where Joseph was buried? They said, Sarach, the daughter of Asher, is the only one left from that first generation. Moses went to Sarach and asked her where Joseph was buried. She answered, the Egyptians made Joseph a coffin out of metal and sunk his body in the Nile River in order to bless the waters. Moses went to the river and said, Joseph, Joseph, God's oath to take the Jews out of Egypt is being fulfilled, and it is time to fulfill the oath that you put on the Jewish people. Now listen, the Jewish people being held back because are being held back because of you. If you reveal yourself, good. If not, we are free from our promise. Immediately, Joseph's coffin surfaced. Okay, so Moses goes to the river, says, you gotta, if you don't tell me where you are, I'm out of here. Rabbi Nassan says that Joseph's remains were in a tomb of kings. Moses stood at the tomb and cried, Joseph, Joseph. Immediately, Joseph's coffin began to shake, and Moses took the coffin. So, anyways, back to the point, we see here that Moses was busy finding where Joseph was buried and taking his bones with him to the land of Israel. So the question is, if we know that we just explained that the Jewish people were also very busy doing a mitzvah. They were doing the mitzvah that God had commanded them to take this gold and silver, and there was a spiritual mitzvah as well. So, but nonetheless, Moses is praised for choosing to be busy with Joseph rather than to be involved with the gold and silver of the Egyptians. So there must be some sort of lesson here of what is Moses doing right? Are the Jewish people doing something wrong? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So there's a famous parable that could explain this idea as follows: that there was once a king who invited everybody to the palace, and the people were so impressed by the palace, they were so blinded by the gold and the silver and the designs that they never ended up making it to the king's chamber, and they got stuck. They're like, wow, look at these lobbies and antechambers, etc. They never got to the king, and they forgot that what was the purpose was the king. And the same thing is true with Moses, is that yes, the Jewish people were doing something important, right? They were just the same way the king's antechambers are important in the parable. And however, if you don't get to the point, to the king himself, you miss the point. So in other words, even though that God commanded the Jewish people to plunder Egypt, to take everything that they had, we shouldn't forget that there was something even more important than that, which was the Jewish people's connection to the previous generation, to Joseph, to the leader of the Jewish people who had promised them that there would be a redemption. So you could get all lost in that God had told Abraham they would come out with wealth. But what was the main thing? Was that their connection to Abraham through Joseph, the connection to Abraham, and therefore their connection to God. So Moses realized that there was something way more important here. So sometimes we come to a situation where we have multiple mitzvahs, multiple good deeds that we could be involved with. We could be involved with something that is a mitzvah, something that's important, but it could be the wrong thing for us to focus on in that moment. And therefore, Moses is praised for recognizing the crux and the most important thing, which was the connection to Joseph. And the question is, how do we know what is the right thing? And the answer is, you have to look to Joseph. You have to look to the Jewish sages and the leaders of our generation, and they're the ones who are to tell us what is our mission and our principles and our good deeds that we should be focused on. And if the Joseph of our generation tells us that we should be focused on something, that's a proof that is more important than any other good thing that we can be involved with. So therefore, Moses is praised for choosing to connect to Joseph, to focus on what was really important, even though what the Jewish people were doing was also a good deed and also a mitzvah. So it's really a lesson in priorities. It's a lesson on knowing when is the right time to pick a good deed to do. Wishing everybody a good Shabbos, and God willing, we will see you next week.